The threat was delivered from the Rose Garden. The president stood at the podium flanked by the Commerce Secretary and the United States Trade Representative and announced a proposed tariff schedule that would apply to Canadian agricultural exports across every major category: grain, canola, beef, pork, potatoes, seafood, dairy, tariff rates ranging from 25 to 40% effective within 30 days unless Canada returned to the negotiating table on the broader bilateral trade framework. His concluding statement captured the assumed leverage with a clarity that would become historically significant within 24 hours. He said, "Let's see how long Canada holds out when American buyers stop buying. Canadian farmers are going to beg their government to come back to the table, and their government is going to listen because they have no other choice." 18 hours later, Canada held a press conference, and the United States discovered that every single assumption underneath that threat had already been wrong for at least a year. This is the Global Report. Tonight, we take you inside the most consequential trade miscalculation in modern North American history. Before we continue, we want to hear from you. When you hear about a trade war, do you assume the smaller economy is always the one that has to scramble? Or do you think preparation can change that equation entirely? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Tell us where you are writing from. We read every response. The administration's threat rested on 4 assumptions. Every single one was wrong. First, that American market access was irreplaceable. True in 1975, progressively less true every year since. Second, that alternative buyers at scale did not exist and would take years to develop. Third, that Canada's food sector could not survive a supply disruption of any meaningful duration. And fourth, that Canadian farmers would pressure Ottawa to capitulate and Ottawa would listen. 4 assumptions, 4 errors. All of them had been wrong for at least a year before the threat was delivered, some for closer to 2. The decision inside Ottawa that bilateral stability would not return under the current American administration had been made approximately 18 months earlier. The conclusion was unanimous across the Prime Minister's office, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Finance, the Department of Agriculture, and the National Security Establishment. Canadian economic security could not rest on the commercial goodwill of a foreign administration that had repeatedly demonstrated willingness to weaponize economic relationships against Canadian interests. What followed was 18 months of coordinated strategic repositioning, visible in individual announcements, but never assembled by any American agency into the coherent strategic picture those announcements formed in aggregate, until the Ottawa press conference forced the assembly. By then, the preparation was complete. The contracts were signed. The logistics infrastructure was in place. Trump's threat was not the crisis. It was the activation signal. Within 18 hours of the Rose Garden announcement, Canada's trade minister stood at a press conference in Ottawa, signed contract folders arranged in front of her, and on screens along the wall behind her, live video feeds from 7 partner nations. The European Commissioner for Trade appeared from Brussels, the Japanese Minister of Agriculture from Tokyo, the South Korean Minister for Trade from Seoul, the Indian Commerce Minister from Delhi, the Indonesian Trade Minister from Jakarta, the Mexican Secretary of Economy from Mexico City, and the United Kingdom Trade Secretary from London. Each minister spoke briefly to confirm specific commercial agreements already finalized with Canada, not agreements in principle, not framework understandings, not scheduled exploratory meetings. Fully executed, commercially binding, immediately operational supply arrangements that would begin absorbing redirected Canadian agricultural exports within the week. The European Union framework absorbed approximately $8 billion in annual Canadian grain, canola, and pork exports. Japan and South Korea committed to roughly $6 billion annually in Canadian beef, grain, and seafood, simultaneously displacing American suppliers in both markets. India covered $4 billion in Canadian pulses and grain through a quiet 2-year negotiation. Indonesia covered $2 billion in grain and protein products. Mexico covered $3 billion through the restructured CPKC rail corridor Canada had spent 18 months rebuilding. The United Kingdom added $2 billion in post-Brexit agricultural partnership commitments, total committed volume, approximately $25 billion, offsetting the vast majority of the $30 billion in threatened Canadian exports to the American market. The staging of that press conference was not accidental. Every element was designed to communicate one thing: Canada was not scrambling, Canada was not reacting, Canada was not improvising, Canada was activating a plan that had been complete and ready for months. The trade minister said it directly. These agreements represent the culmination of a deliberate Canadian trade diversification strategy developed over the past 18 months. They were not developed in response to today's threat. They were developed in anticipation of a day when Canada might need alternatives to the American market. That day has arrived. Second question of the evening. Do you think other countries were watching this and quietly building their own contingency plans against American trade pressure? Tell us in the comments. Specify your country or professional background. We are reading every response. The reaction inside the White House confirmed something the administration had not been prepared to face. The primary negotiating lever it believed it was about to deploy had already been neutralized, in advance, by preparation that American intelligence and trade diplomacy had entirely failed to detect. Trump's public response came within 3 hours. By his standards, it was unusually disoriented. He threatened tariffs his own advisors privately acknowledged would harm American consumers more than Canadian exporters. He claimed nobody buys Canadian food except us, a statement contradicted in real time by live video feeds from 7 international trade ministers visible on screens around the world. The press event ended abruptly when a reporter asked whether the administration had been aware of the Canadian alternative buyer negotiations in advance. The non-answer said everything. Behind the scenes, the intelligence failure was worse than the public response suggested. The coordinated Canadian trade diplomacy had been operating across 4 government departments with active participation from major agricultural industry associations and private trading houses. Every individual agreement had been negotiated through normal diplomatic channels that American intelligence and trade liaison offices should have been monitoring. Each element had appeared in open-source reporting across the 18-month period. The failure was not a failure of intelligence collection, it was a failure of synthesis. No American agency had assembled the individual pieces into the coherent strategic picture they formed together. The agricultural consequences arrived not in projections but in actual damage. Canadian reciprocal tariffs on American agricultural exports covered approximately $18 billion in annual American exports to Canada. American grain exporters found expected Canadian purchase volumes suddenly absent. American meat processors faced contract cancellations. Farm Belt commodity prices moved against producers within days. Farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, Montana, Indiana, and Illinois received notifications that expected Canadian contracts would not materialize. Farm Credit Association emergency meetings convened across multiple states. Mental health helplines in rural agricultural communities reported call volume increases that local officials directly attributed to economic uncertainty flowing through farm households. 6 Republican senators from Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana issued joint statements demanding immediate diplomatic recalibration. The American Farm Bureau issued a statement describing the administration's trade strategy as strategically counterproductive and tactically failed, language never previously applied to any Republican administration in its century-long history. The National Grain and Feed Association, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and the National Pork Producers Council followed within the same week. The administration's own business coalition was visibly breaking down across the sectors that had constituted its strongest support. International amplification compounded the domestic pressure. European, Asian, and Commonwealth leaders publicly celebrated the new partnerships with Canada in ways that made each announcement compound the humiliation of the failed American threat. The pattern that American commentators had been slow to assemble became impossible to ignore. The Canadian confrontations across 18 months were not a series of isolated responses. They were a single integrated strategy that had been executing while American policy treated each episode as separate. Every subsequent American trade threat will now be evaluated through the lens of what Canada demonstrated, which means every subsequent American trade threat will be met with the assumption that the target has been preparing, which deflates American threat capacity globally in ways that would take decades to rebuild. Chinese trade analysts published commentary describing the Canadian strategy as the template for managing American economic coercion. European trade ministries quietly accelerated their own contingency planning. Japanese, Korean, and Indonesian officials issued internal guidance about diversification. Every major trading partner of the United States is now reconsidering its own preparation. American trade leverage has not been damaged only against Canada. American trade leverage has been globally repriced. Then Carney stood in Ottawa with trade ministers from 6 partner nations visible on screens behind him, signed contracts on the table, provincial premiers seated in the second row. Visible confirmation of federal-provincial alignment that left no doubt about the unified Canadian position. He began with acknowledgement of the genuine partnerships between Canadian and American producers, the integrated supply chains, the shared history of continental food security. Then he transitioned with measured precision to the strategic assessment that had shaped 18 months of Canadian policy. He said, Canada cannot allow the economic security of Canadian farmers, Canadian food processors, and Canadian rural communities to depend on the commercial goodwill of a foreign government whose current leadership has repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to weaponize economic relationships against Canadian interests. That obligation cannot be discharged through hope. It can only be discharged through preparation. Then he paused, looked directly into the cameras, and delivered 11 words now being quoted in every trade ministry, every diplomatic service, and every business strategy consultancy on earth. You threatened the buyer. We had already found the next one. The silence held longer than protocol required. Within 4 minutes, that sentence was trending globally. Within the hour, it was on the front pages of the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, and every major business publication in Europe, Asia, and the Commonwealth. It became the defining framing of one principle that every government watching is now internalizing. Preparation is not a defensive strategy. Preparation is the strategy. The party that prepares for a confrontation while the other party prepares to deliver one has already won before the confrontation begins. Canada spent 18 months building what the administration assumed would never be needed. Those reserves were excessive until they were the only reserves that mattered. Here's where this stands tonight. The United States threatened Canadian food exports and discovered within 18 hours that $25 billion in alternative buyer agreements were already signed, already activated, and already executing. 4 assumptions underlying the threat were wrong. All 4 had been wrong for at least a year. American intelligence failed to synthesize 18 months of visible preparation into the coherent strategic picture it formed in aggregate. Republican farm state senators broke with the White House in unprecedented numbers. American agricultural industry associations issued the most critical statements in their institutional histories, and every future American trade relationship is now evaluated through the lens of what Canadian preparation demonstrated about American threat capacity. 11 words changed the calculation. You threatened the buyer. We had already found the next one. And every nation that has ever worried about being next is now building the plan that makes those words possible. If this kind of analysis is what you have been looking for, subscribe to the Global Report right now and hit the bell icon. We publish twice a week. We go further than the headlines every single time. You will not want to miss what comes next. This is the Global Report, the story behind the story, every time.